Good evening, everyone. My name's Jeremy. I'm leading these Monday night sessions this month. We've been looking at practices for dealing with afflictive emotions this month, and so this is the fourth week. And last week we were looking at practice for dealing with attachment, and the week before that, anger. And tonight I thought we could look at some practices for dealing with anxiety and fear and stress, things like that, which I think we're all familiar with. So we'll do some meditation and have some discussion, and feel free to ask questions as I go along or make comments. We've had some good discussions this month. So we'll start off by doing some meditation, and as I keep saying, as I've been saying each week, when we're doing meditation, what we're trying to do is focus our mind, and the two main tools we're using for focusing our mind are mindfulness and alertness. So mindfulness is remembering the object that we're focusing on, keeping it in mind, and alertness, which is sometimes called vigilance, is observing the concentration to see how it's going, to see whether your mind has wandered. So that they're the main two mental faculties we're trying to utilize and develop. So in the meditation we'll do tonight, it's similar. So we'll start off by doing some breathing meditation, which we've been doing. So in that meditation, you're just focusing on your breath, moving in and out. But then once our mind has settled a bit, then we use that concentration, and there's a technique where you just observe your mind, but you allow it to wander. So in the other concentration meditations, we're trying to stop our mind from wandering. In this meditation, you allow your mind to wander. But what you do is you observe your mind wandering. So, for example, a sound might come up, a sound in the room, someone coughing, and your mind might go to that sound. So the idea is that you observe your mind going to that object, and the idea is that you observe your mind without following it, or without sort of becoming involved in what it's doing. So you don't get involved because often we find that we get involved in a train of thought, and our mind is carried away, and then 10 minutes later we remember that, I was supposed to be meditating, we've been thinking about something, one thought has led to another. So the idea with this meditation is just to observe your mind wandering, which is quite a unusual way of using our mind. I think it's not something we're familiar with, but give it a try, see how it goes. Yeah, and I'll talk a bit as we go along. So, as usual, we'll just sit in a comfortable posture. So, a posture which helps us to remain alert and also focused. So, helpful to have your back straight to stop you getting drowsy. And also just to relax your body. And can be helpful to make a decision to stop thinking about all the things that you've been preoccupied with today. And then bring your attention to your breath, and observe your breath moving in and out. So we're trying to focus our mind now just on the breath, and to stop our mind wandering to other things. It can be helpful to focus on the sensation of the breath moving past the tip of your nose. So mindfulness is keeping that object in mind, which is the breath. And alertness is checking to see whether your mind has wandered to other objects, other mental objects. So see if you can keep your mind on that point, on that object for 9 breaths. So breathing in and out is 1 breath. Try to place your mind without wandering for 9 breaths. So now just relax your concentration and allow your mind to wander to various objects. So stop trying to direct your concentration and just allow your mind to become aware or to follow thoughts. And the idea of this meditation is that you just observe your mind wandering from one mental object to another. So, for example, your mind might wander to the sound of the heater, the fan. So you just observe your mind becoming aware of that. Then after a while your mind wanders to other objects, for example, sensation in your body, like some discomfort in your knee, or thinking about something that happened during the day. So the idea is just observe your mind moving from one mental object to another. Or you might find that your mind does not seem to have any particular mental object. So you can just observe that sort of vacuity. And the whole process should be relaxed and comfortable. It can be helpful to think of your mind as being like the sky, very spacious and clear. And then these thoughts are like clouds passing through the sky. So you just observe them for a while and then they pass on. So we're still using mindfulness and alertness in this meditation. So the object we're being mindful of is whatever appears to the mind. And we're being alert to stopping our mind from becoming overly involved in the object. So we're sort of observing the mind objectively. So if you find that your mind is becoming overly involved in the train of thought, or thinking, becoming too involved in some thought process, you bring it back to that observation point, the objective observer, and just try to observe without getting involved in the thoughts. So if you find that your mind or body becoming uncomfortable, then just try to relax your mind and your body. Okay, thank you. So just relax your concentration. So, any comments or questions about that meditation practice? It's, I think, an unusual way of using our concentration. Probably something that we're not familiar with. Can feel, I think, a bit strange until it becomes familiar. There's a practice in some Buddhist traditions. It's a main practice of meditation. And I've heard it explained, analogy of you think of a ship in the middle of the ocean, and there's a bird on the mast of the ship, and the bird will fly off from the ship and go in all different directions looking for land, and if it doesn't find land, then it will just come back to the mast of the ship and rest there. So it's said that the mind is like that. If you allow the mind to wander without becoming involved in it, just let it wander, then eventually it will settle by itself. So it's a nice analogy. And anyway, something that I think we can experiment with in our meditation and see whether we find that as a sort of a good way of pacifying our distracted thoughts and our afflictive emotions. So I think when you become good at that practice, and I'm not good at it, but the idea is that when you become good at it, then you can observe afflictive emotions like anger and things when they arise. And by just observing them, merely observing them without becoming involved in them, then it's said to pacify them. So you can see how that might work in that you're no longer focused, for example, on the person who's making you angry. You're instead just focused on the thoughts or the sensation arising in your mind of anger, and just observing it arising, like a wave, and then sort of dissipating. So you're not feeding the anger or the fear or the attachment. That's the idea. So I think that takes quite a lot of mindfulness to think about that in the heat of the moment. Anyway, that's one you can experiment with. So we were talking about afflictive emotions, and a point I made, I think, a few weeks ago. In the Buddhist view, they have the idea of the mind being like having infinite potential. So the idea is that you can develop your mind sort of almost infinitely, which may sound a bit sort of like wishful thinking, but I think we can see in our experience it is possible to develop our mind, as in to develop compassion or to develop love or develop patience through doing practice, and develop concentration through practice. So the idea is that these positive states of mind are developed through creating the causes for them. So we develop concentration by practicing mindfulness and alertness. And if we can develop a little bit of of those positive states of mind, then the idea is that by continuing that process, then we can keep developing them, and that there's sort of it's a limitless process. So that's quite an optimistic view, I think, of our mind, the potential for our mind. Something, you know, I think we have to investigate to see whether that's true. Do we have limitless potential, or do we have some sort of limit on our potential? Is there only a certain amount of compassion we can develop, or patience, or concentration? And also the idea that the afflictive emotions are adventitious, which means that they're not in the nature of the mind. So the analogy I used before of the sky and the clouds is used to illustrate that idea, that the afflictive emotions, like anger, are not intrinsic or inherent in the mind. And the evidence for that is that the fact that they come and go. So they arise sometimes and not others, and they arise and dissipate. So if they were intrinsic to the mind, then they should always be there. So the fact that they're not always there shows that they arise depending on certain causes and conditions, and then when those causes and conditions are not there, then those afflictive emotions dissipate. So I think that's also a encouraging idea, to think of our minds as not being sort of inherently, these faults are not inherent, they're adventitious. They're impermanent, and they arise depending on causes and conditions, and then when the causes and conditions are not there, then they dissipate. So this is the idea, at least the Buddhist idea, of having this mind with this sort of infinite potential, but having these adventitious or temporary afflictions which arise in our mind. And also, as I was saying last week, when we investigate the afflictive emotions, like anger, for example, we find that they're based on some mistaken ideas. So they arise because of a mistaken, concept or an unrealistic way of thinking. So you think, for example, of something. Sometimes we get angry about very small things. For example, when you're driving in traffic and someone cuts you off, and you can get really enraged. And then later on you think about it, why was my mind so obsessed about being held up for 5 seconds in the traffic, or someone showing me disrespect? Your mind can become so focused on this, slight insult, and become so upset by it. And you can see how it was based on a mistaken view, where you were blowing that problem up out of all proportion. And in you take a wider perspective, then you can see how insignificant that problem was. But in that moment, your mind became sort of obsessed, or so focused on that small thing, and became so upset by it. So this is the idea. When we analyse these afflictive emotions, and similar with some states of fear and anxiety, and also attachment we were talking about last week, they're based on sort of, for example, exaggerating the seriousness of a problem, or exaggerating the good qualities of something, and then trying to grasp onto them. So again, I think that's a very encouraging idea, to think that these afflictive emotions which we experienced, when we investigate, we find that they're based on mistaken ideas. So by removing the mistaken view, the unrealistic way of thinking, then these afflictive states of mind will dissipate. But again, I think that's something you need to investigate, in your own experience, in your own analytical meditation, to see whether that's true. So when you have like anger arising, think about what is the cause of the anger, what's making it arise, and think about whether it's based on a realistic, sort of balanced view of what's going on, or is it sort of based on some being overly preoccupied with one thing, or exaggerating one thing. Do you agree with that? Does that sound right? And conversely, the idea is that the positive states of mind, like for example compassion, are said to be powerful because they're based on reality. again, that's something we need to investigate. So, like patience, for example, and non-attachment. So non-attachment is a state of mind where we're not exaggerating something. We're having a realistic view about an object, and so we're not grasping onto it. Compassion is said to be realistic because it's based on the understanding that other people are experiencing problems in the same way as we are. And we can see that that's true. So again, that's quite encouraging, I think, to think that positive thoughts are based on a realistic view. Negative thoughts are based on an unrealistic view. That's the idea. Okay. So I was going to talk a bit about fear and anxiety and stress. So I think firstly we need to be clear about what we're talking about here. But I think we probably all agree that stress is a problem for us. It's something we experience probably a bit on a daily basis to some extent. I was wondering whether maybe it's more of a problem for modern Western people, but I'm not sure, because I notice in the Buddhist literature it is not talked about a lot, as in stress and anxiety. And I was wondering whether maybe it's more of a problem for us modern people than it was in traditional Buddhist societies. Because there's a lot of talk about anger and attachment and pride, jealousy. Maybe you have some ideas about why that might be. But what I'm talking about is, I think things we're all familiar with, and there's probably a range of emotions which are related to fear and anxiety. So from a sort of low-level anxiety, like for example feeling shy when you're meeting new people or in a group of people you don't know, or having sort of nervousness, when you have to speak to a group of people, for example, having that kind of nervousness. I think feeling overwhelmed, like sometimes you feel like you have too much responsibility and so many things to do, and you're sort of feeling overwhelmed, and how can I can't sort of having sort of fear or doubt that you won't be able to meet your responsibilities. Feeling intimidated, for example, if someone is very aggressive towards you and you sort of feel like frozen or overwhelmed by their aggression. A common one is stress, work-related stress, which is often to do with things like not being able to meet deadlines, not being able to keep up with the workload that you've been given, and being worried about disappointing people or people thinking that you're incompetent or lazy or so these are common things that we face. I think also more sort of I guess you'd say like existential sort of anxieties about like about getting old, for example, or when your body starts to age and you're seeing that happening, and then you're losing your youth and your beauty, and you see those things disappearing, and anxiety about that. And also I think now a common problem we have is anxiety about the state of the world, and I wonder whether like I find on social media, for example, you get interested in things like to do with the environment or to do with human rights or animal rights, and then you start to get bombarded by all this information about all the problems that are happening in those spheres, and it starts to become so overwhelming. And so you can develop sort of anxiety about, you feel like the whole world's sort of just, falling apart. So these are, I think, this sort of a range of emotions, that we're talking about. Also, like having a shock, when you have a car accident, like a near miss when you're driving, for example, and you get sort of a fright. And another interesting one, I think, which is also a common problem, is fear of fear itself. So, for example, you might find that you avoid certain situations because you know that they're going to be stressful. But the main discomfort in that situation is fear itself. So you're sort of fearful of fear itself. I think that's also something we're all familiar with. And I think, like attachment, fear is something quite tricky, and I think it operates often on a sort of almost subliminal level, or often we're not aware, I think, of the way it's affecting us. And we can have this sort of anxiety there that we're not even aware of. So I think this is where meditation can be very helpful, where you can sit down and observe your mind. And sometimes I find it helpful to talk to myself. You know, it's like you're feeling a bit stressed or something. You say, "What's wrong? Why? How are you feeling?" And then you can sort of talk to yourself. "Oh, well, I just feel quite stressed, I think." And they go, "Oh, okay. Well, what are you stressed about?" And you can sort of, it can help to verbalize it. Well, I guess it's to do with work, and there's this and that. So you can sort of, give yourself a counselling session, and it can be quite helpful just to verbalize what's going on in your mind. And you might find that you become aware of things that were happening in your mind that you weren't really aware it was going on. You're just feeling uncomfortable and not really sure why. So this kind of introspection, I think, can be very helpful. So then I think if we can sort of agree that's what we're talking about with fear and anxiety and stress, do you more or less agree with that sort of range of emotions? And does that kind of, do you think, cover most of them? Are there other things you'd like to throw in there? So I think once we've identified those kind of emotions and we agree that they are afflictive, in that they are uncomfortable, they cause us to feel discomfort, and they also are debilitating, so they can prevent us from doing things, and can be very exhausting, I think, feeling that kind of anxiety, and also creates problems for our mental health and our physical health. So then I think we need to make a distinction between helpful fear and unhelpful fear, because I think we'd have to agree that there is some fear that is helpful. So I was thinking, for example, of like if you're trying to give up smoking, for example, and then you met someone who's suffering from emphysema, like developed late stage emphysema, is really struggling to breathe, then you seeing their suffering and then feeling fear that you can end up having that same suffering. So that kind of fear could be helpful in helping you to get over attachment to smoking. So you can see how I think you'd agree that some fear can be helpful. So then I think we need to be very careful and distinguish carefully between what fear is helpful and what is not helpful. And there are some Buddhist practices where you sort of encourage fear to arise, and you use that fear to motivate you to do something positive. But I think we have to be very careful and very, maybe judicious or something, very clear about which fear is helpful and which is not. And perhaps some fear which is helpful in some situations is not helpful in others. So if you became, in the example of trying to give up smoking, a certain amount of fear could help you to give up smoking. But if you became so overwhelmed by that fear and just felt, there's no point, I'm going to die of lung cancer, so there's no point giving up, so I'll just keep smoking. So the fear may actually make the problem worse. And I remember when I worked in a hospital, there were patients who could barely breathe, but they were still smoking. So I guess they'd figure, I'm so sick, I might as well just enjoy cigarettes. And then they'd lost limbs, they'd amputated fingers and hands and things. So we need to be very clear, I think, about what is helpful fear and what is unhelpful. And I would say that I think most fear is unhelpful. You don't have to agree with me here, but in my opinion, I think a lot of the fear that we experience is unhelpful. And I think maybe the way we need to measure it is by looking at the fear and asking ourselves, is this fear motivating me to do something positive? So you could feel anxiety, for example, about about the environment, about global warming, and then you might think, well, it's good to be a bit concerned about that. But then you think, is that anxiety or concern, is that actually motivating me to do anything about it? So if it's not, if it's just making you feel uncomfortable or unhappy, then you have to say, well, is there any point having that sort of anxiety? So I think we need to be carefully analysing the kind of fear and anxiety that arises in our mind and ask, whether it is helpful or not. And I suggest that most of it is not helpful. Yes. Yeah, I agree. But I think that's probably a good example of where fear is probably not really helpful. I mean, you'd probably do a much better job if you didn't have any fear and anxiety. Because, I think giving a talk, I think naturally you'd want to sort of do a good job because people are coming to listen to you. So you do some preparation, and I don't think the fear would really help you at all to prepare. I think conscientiousness would be the thing that's sort of motivating you there, and the fear will just get in your way. Yeah. But don't you think in some cases it could motivate you to do something positive? Like the example of overcoming attachment to something that's harmful to you. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I can sort of see how it could actually be something that would help you to overcome particularly attachment to something that's sort of self-inflicted harm, really. But I'm not sure. I mean, it's something I think we need to investigate. Any other views? Do you think fear can be helpful? Has anyone experienced helpful fear? Yeah. 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 So what would be an example of that, do you think, like the way... Yeah. Yeah. But I think Ingrid's point is that that's more like intelligence rather than fear. I mean, could you just make that decision based on intelligence rather than fear? Like, well, I don't know anything about electrical wiring side, but maybe it's both. Yeah. Yeah, but I guess you could argue that, because we do have intelligence, that we can survive based purely on intelligence rather than needing fear. I'm not saying that's not really my view, but I'm just saying you could argue that.
The brain has the need to learn, the campus which are survival instincts, we don't have any control over them really, and they're the things that aren't always all around the family working at things upstream, and it's really operates at the subconscious level. So the intelligence doesn't really link to it, but that's important in our survival mechanism. We can think logically in hindsight, and perhaps logically if the fear allowed us to take some time to think whether or not we were going to be. But when we need to act on instinct, automatics, brain, neurological systems.
But I think the instinctual response can also be problematic, as in, if you fight or flight, and the fighting can actually just cause things to escalate and be. So I think, yeah, but that's a good point.
Environment that we are even fear in some way, there would be thousands of years ago, probably, where we have to continue with the biggest species that would be relevant for the things nowadays using intelligence.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Different kind of fear. It's not just everyday fear. It's like a real panic type, fight or flight. And many people respond to that to a crisis at work, which probably isn't life-threatening.
Yeah. So I think most of the fear that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis is not that kind of life-threatening. So. Yeah, so we're tending to overreact. I think you might have heard there was some research about things that people are fearful of, and they rate fear of public speaking as sort of more than dying. So it's sort of, what are they most scared of? So you can see how our mind sort of exaggerates the threat. Yeah.
Is that just where the language is? But also fear there. I'd say that's just being apprehensive.
Yeah.
Fear.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Like degrees of fear.
Yes.
So is it really the language? Each situation is a little different in degrees, and just the one word fear doesn't describe it.
Yeah.
It's an apprehension.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. But I guess the idea is to think about all this sort of a range of emotions, and I'm sort of lumping them into a group because I think they're all similar in that you're sort of perceiving a threat and you're reacting in a way that's uncomfortable and makes your mind uncomfortable, unhappy, and you also have a physical sort of reaction. So I'm putting like apprehension and stress and anxiety and nervousness and even shyness. I think they're all sort of on the same kind of continuum. But again, that's something, you know, we need to check up to see whether we agree with that.
What about the fear of God?
Fear of God? Yeah. Well, again, I guess, as I was saying, in Buddhism there is some practices where you're encouraging fear because it's said to be helpful, and then because it's meant to inspire you, to motivate you to take action, positive action. So again, I think even when we're practicing, doing spiritual practices, we need to check up still whether this fear is helpful or not. Because I think, you know, even in Buddhist practice you can use too much fear and it can become, you know, not helpful. So we have to measure whether it's helpful or not in our own practice. Be skillful, yeah. Okay, so I'll just move on. So that was one point about distinguishing between good fear and bad fear, which I think is very important. And I think often we make the mistake of thinking that the fear is helpful when in fact it's not. And there's one famous Buddhist saint who made this sort of, I think, humorous comment that if you can fix a problem or remedy a problem, then you don't need to worry about it, because you can just work on fixing it. And if you can't fix it, then it's useless to worry about it, because there's nothing you can do about it. So then the point is that in most situations really worrying is not helpful. On the other hand, there are Buddhist practices, as I said, where you're encouraged to meditate on fear because it motivates you. So we have to be skillful and distinguish which is helpful and which is not. Okay, so then the faults of fear, I think we've kind of covered that, and I think they're fairly obvious, you know, as in, you know, feeling uncomfortable and having sort of, like you're talking about, feeling paralyzed, and then there's, you know, stress-related problems, like not being able to sleep, and eating, you know, having problems with your digestion and things like that, often related to stress, even high blood pressure. I think also one thing about fear and probably all afflictive emotions is that they can become very habitual, and we can also almost become attached to them, so that this sort of feeling of sort of anxiety can become so familiar that it becomes like a normal state of being. And so that is a problem in itself. We become so familiar with it. And this is again where meditation is very helpful, where we analyze what's happening in our mind and determine whether it's helpful or not. You know, is this thought helpful? Is this thought based on realistic thinking? Is it motivating me to take positive action, or is it just debilitating? So then the causes of fear, and we've talked about that a little bit also. So we're talking about unhelpful fear here, and this is fear based on exaggerating the threat. So it's exaggerating how harmful something is going to be. So again, I think that's something we can see in our own experience, where we exaggerate. Probably fear of public speaking is a good example. You know, people say, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? You know, you can just stuff up badly and say something foolish, or, you know, people will just not like what you say. So the worst case scenario, it's helpful to think about the worst case scenario. What's the worst thing that can happen? And that can help to overcome, you know, exaggerating the fear of what's going to happen. Yeah.
With the example of public
Mm.
speaking, a lot of the anxiety which the speaker gets is because of the concentration on itself
Mm.
and what happens with itself, what happens with the mind.
Yeah.
As opposed to the thought process that you're actually being applied to people to hear the message.
Yeah.
And this is where the Buddhist conceptualization helps, because the concept of life doesn't exist as such.
Well, the concept exists, but the Buddhist view is that the I does not exist in the way that it appears, or the way we normally think it does. Yeah.
And that the fact that the speaker is there
Yeah.
And therefore it takes the mind off the I and the self and feels it happens to itself. And
Yeah. Yeah, I agree totally. So I think, and that's one of the, I think, main practices for overcoming fear, is it said that fear arises because of a preoccupation with this self. And as you say, when you're giving a public talk and you feel everyone's focused on this self. And so if you can take your mind away from that and just focus on all the people instead of the self, then you can see how that immediately releases you from that being so narrowly focused on the welfare of this one being. And that's taught us, that's why compassion is very central practice in Buddhism and other traditions, I think, because it immediately frees you from that preoccupation with this oneself and makes the whole focus of your mind much broader. And so, yeah, you can see how that, solves that problem or remedies that problem, yeah. Mm. And there's one Buddhist teacher who teaches almost, only on that, using compassion to overcome fear. And that's, you might have heard of Pema Chodron. She's an American Buddhist nun teacher. So that's, I think, one of her main themes. She just talks about that. So she's saying that we have all this fear and we're trying to protect this self, and if we can just let go of that and focus on others, then all of these problems just sort of will fade away, because they're all arising because of this focus on I. Yeah. Mm. So that's a good point. Okay, so causes of fear, like exaggerating the threat, and then I think also, as we're saying, incorrectly thinking that the fear is somehow helpful for you, when in fact it's not. So it's like incorrectly valuing the fear. And then also force of habit, so having a sort of habit of being fearful. Okay. So then, how do we overcome fear? What are the practices that we can do to remedy the fear? And we're just talking about one there, practice of compassion, overcoming self-centered view by focusing on others and others' welfare. And I think other practices are, for example, we're doing mindfulness and alertness. So if our mind is focused on something, even if it's just our breath, and it's focused single-pointedly on that thing, then the mind is not feeling fearful. So that's a way of protecting your mind, by using mindfulness and alertness to keep your mind focused on something which is not generating these afflictive emotions. So you can see how that works, that if you can develop mindfulness and alertness and keep your mind focused on something which is making your mind feel peaceful and happy. So that in itself is a practice. And then also the meditation that we did before, where we're just observing the afflictive emotion like fear. So you can observe something like fear objectively, and the idea is that by observing it objectively, then it becomes less problematic. So you can just feel that it's like just a sensation or a thought arising in your mind, and you just observe it arising and not become involved with it, not react to it, and not even say this is bad. You just observe it arising, or this is just a thought and a feeling arising, and I'm observing it arising, and then after a while it just dissipates. So you can see how that sort of observation of the feeling can work. And that's said to be a powerful practice for subduing afflictive emotions. And then the analysis that we were talking about before, I think, is also very important, and asking yourself whether this fear is helpful or not. So just observing the fear and sort of unpacking it, analysing it, asking yourself, why is this fear arising? Why is it arising now? And what are the ideas that this fear is based on? Like, what is the worst case scenario, and is this fear helpful? So it can be helpful to sort of, like I was saying, talk aloud and have a discussion with yourself about the fear, or even write it down. What am I fearful about? Is this helpful or not? Sort of analysing it in that way. I remember one talk where someone asked the Dalai Lama practices for overcoming fear, and he said that meditation on cause and effect was a remedy for fear. And I sort of didn't really understand that answer. I was thinking about how would that work? And I think what he's getting at there is like we were talking about before, is when we're exaggerating the seriousness of the threat. So if we meditate on cause and effect, then you think about, well, if this happens, then what will happen after that? So thinking about cause and effect relationships. So I think often when we're fearful, we're thinking irrationally that if I do this, then a whole lot of terrible things are going to happen. Maybe that kind of so it's a way of overcoming that sort of irrational thought processes where we sort of start to panic or exaggerate the threat. So thinking about step-by-step cause and effect. If I do this, then this might happen. If I don't do this, then this won't happen. So that's an interesting idea. And I think also identifying how fear arises because of things like attachment. So last week we were talking about attachment. So if you're very strongly attached to something, or even to an idea, or to even an idea about yourself, that you would naturally be fearful of losing that thing. So you think of someone who's very attached to their position or high status, and for example, if you are a celebrity, a movie star or something like that, you might constantly have anxiety about losing your high status. So you may be worried about your image, or your how beautiful your body is, for example, or something like that. So you can see if you're strongly attached to something, then you're going to necessarily be fearful about losing it. So overcoming attachment to things is going to reduce the fear of losing that. So again, that's something useful to look at. What is this fear arising because of attachment? And what is it I'm attached to that's causing the fear? So I think they're the main practices that we can do for overcoming attachment. The other one that's taught is, as you were talking about, the idea of selflessness or emptiness. And this is the idea that the self that we're so preoccupied with is actually like it's an illusion, in that it doesn't exist in the way that we think it exists. So the idea is that we think of the self as being somehow inherently existent, as somehow findable, and existing independently, from its own side. But when we investigate, we can't find a self that exists in that way. So we look in these meditations on emptiness, you examine the person, you think, oh, okay, well, Jeremy's here, but then you meditate and try and investigate and find where is Jeremy, so you look through all the body, Jeremy's not in the body, and then you look through all the parts of the mind. Can't find Jeremy in anger, and he's not in attachment, and he's not in mindfulness, and he's not in alertness, and he's not in the train of thoughts which are going on. So completely not findable amongst the body and the mind. So the conclusion of that meditation is to see that the idea of the self is just it's said to be merely labelled. It's like like a thought, an idea. So it's this concrete self that we're so protective of and fearful of. Its welfare we can't find that self. So that's a very interesting idea, and something, again, to investigate through meditation. But that's said to be the most powerful technique for overcoming all the afflictive emotions. That and meditating on compassion. So there's a lot in there, a lot of practices we can do. The main point I wanted to get across is just to appreciate that fear is something that is common and we experience it, and also something that may be happening, affecting us in ways that we're not aware of, and also to analyze carefully whether the fear that and anxiety and worry and concern we have, whether that is helpful or not, to investigate carefully, and if it's not, then we need to make effort to discard that, to overcome that, and we can do that by doing these practices. So that's something to investigate. Okay, so we're out of time. Any comments or questions before we go? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I think to be realistic about what you can change and what you can't. Yeah. There's a Shantideva, the Buddhist master I was talking about before, has a nice quote that he said you have a choice between putting leather on the soles of your feet or trying to cover the whole surface of the earth with leather. So he's saying it's much easier to put leather on the soles of your feet. So what that means is referring to is it's much easier to change your mind rather than trying to change the whole world. So if you change your mind, then your experience of the world is, you can change it in a way that the world, for you at least, is a very pleasant place to be. Everything is manageable through changing your mind. Which is not to say we shouldn't try to, change things that we can in the world. But we have to be realistic about what we can and not worry about what we can't. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have some beneficial practices to take away with you. Thanks.